Media literacy is a term we see thrown around a lot these days. It's become one of those buzzwords that shows up almost everywhere as soon as you become aware of it. And not without reason. In this world, stuffed to the brim with media of every possible perspective and viewpoint, it's no surprise that the ability to sift through it and understand what exactly you're looking at has become a subject of mass conversation. However, as anyone who has interacted with this concept for more than a day has discovered, while one might think that it's intended to foster discussions about understanding the things we consume, it's just as often a cudgel used to call anyone who doesn't agree with someone's personal interpretation of something stupid. The first search result for the term comes from Oxford Languages and defines media literacy as the ability to critically analyze stories presented in the mass media and to determine their accuracy and credibility. And that's a good enough definition, considering the people at Oxford are probably smarter than me or anyone else who wants to talk to you about media literacy. Anyhow, the reason we're talking about this now is because I think that media literacy has been spoiled as a term and is basically just a weapon on the internet now. Not that that's very surprising. What better way to make yourself sound smarter than someone else in a faux intellectual way than to call them media illiterate? But I digress. What I'd actually like to do with this video is analyze the media literacy phenomenon from the perspective of something I know very well. Because, fittingly enough, one common example of media illiteracy is people needing to get the first take in on something they've barely or not even seen, just because having the first take on something is more important than having a good take on something algorithmically on the internet. But that thing I know very well, and that we'll be talking about rather extensively, is Fire Emblem Three Houses. Everyone in the audience who knows this game either just commented the phrase Edelgard Discourse all over again, or is very excited. But that's exactly why it's the perfect example of this phenomenon and why you should stick around even if you don't know anything about this game. So let's fix that so that we can start getting on the same level. Fire Emblem Three Houses released in 2019, and it's a strategy RPG that takes place in the medieval fantasy world of Fodlan. You take on the position of professor at one of three classes at Garreg Mach Officers Academy, and whichever class you choose at the beginning will define the rest of the game for you in a way that is really quite impressive for a singular game. If there's any Fire Emblem game that you've heard of, it's probably this one, and it's probably my favorite game of all time. Warts and all. It's not perfect, but it's pretty well written, and that's why it sparked this discourse we're going to be framing our media literacy discussion in. Bear in mind as well, I'll be spoiling it a lot, so if you've been meaning to play it and haven't yet, you could do that now and come back. If not, I don't blame you. It's a very long game as well, especially to get through every route, of which the game has 4 playable routes between the 3 classes. There is Verdant Wind, where you side with Claude, heir to the Leicester Alliance; Azure Moon, where you side with Dimitri, Prince of Fargus; Crimson Flower, where you side with Edelgard, Princess of the Adrestian Empire; and Silver Snow, where you pick Edelgard's class, but then don't stick with her throughout the rest of the game. We can make our introduction and explanation here a lot easier by more or less cutting out any discussion of the first and last of those routes of the game. They're both, for one, quite similar to each other, and 2, do not concern the main thing that people are angry about with this game, and that's whether Edelgard is right or wrong. Right about what? Well, we'll get to that momentarily, because the first pit stop in our media literacy discussion, more or less, is right here. When you ask people what their favorite route in the game is, nobody says Silver Snow, or at least I've yet to see it. A lot of people, however, will say Verdant Wind, and with that alone, you can tell exactly how that person engaged with the game. Because don't get me wrong, this game discusses some things you probably wouldn't expect out of glorified anime chess, but Claude's route kind of doesn't. It's a fairly simple story in which the war between the houses, which dominates Dimitri and Edelgard's routes, is sort of a side quest for a final confrontation that comes later and is a lot more morally simple. Claude's route skips the controversial ideas, and in Claude himself being a tiny bit underwritten. I mean, his whole thing is that he's a schemer, but I think his only successful scheme is staying out of this game's discourse. And that results in the people who like his route being the types who are just there for a good time with the funny characters and getting to beat up a scary bad guy at the end of the game. And maybe this is a hot take, but I think that's completely fine. You can enjoy the game however you want. Claude's route is fun, but that is an archetype of person who engages with media that is worth talking about. A sort of media literacy. A person who's happy to more or less take the direct route to an interpretation of the thing they've engaged with, and not focus on the big ideas quite so much as the minutiae that they particularly enjoyed, most often in this specific case being the character of Claude himself, who, while, maybe a little underwritten, is still very charming and a lot of fun to be around. I mean, they definitely aren't there for the way those who slither in the dark are handled, because they are easily the game's biggest conceptual flop, but alas, that'll be talked about a little more later. When you get to those of us who prefer Dimitri or Edelgard, the game's other two main characters, things get both more complex and in some cases way dumber. So to bring those of you who are lost further back up to speed, the essential conflict that sets off the events of the game's second act is that Edelgard declares war on basically everyone else on the continent of Fodlan, though her main target is the Church of Saros, which ran the academy you were a professor at in the first act. Her goal is to dismantle the church and the crest system, a form of inherited powerful magic, and create a more equitable future. Dimitri is her first and strongest opponent, and while his large-scale reasons for keeping up the war on the defensive end are sort of misguided, he does fight to protect his homeland and the people he cares about from the war that Edelgard brings to his doorstep, even though this whole thing results in bringing out a side of him that is violent, unlike anything we actually see from any of the other characters. This is probably the simplest and more or less accurate way of describing the conflict that defines the game, but Occam's razor breaks a bit here because this is not nearly enough to understand the situation, but that's also why the game is so interesting. Here's where media literacy returns to us again. Opinions between players run very, very strong about this conflict, because if you side with Edelgard, you will kill Dimitri later in the game, and if you side with Dimitri, Edelgard will die too. In fact, even among the other two routes, there is not a single one where they both survive between Edelgard and Dimitri. And in fact, both of them die in every route except their own. Only Claude is capable of surviving every single ending, which is sort of another reason he's just not part of this conversation. Now, while I'm not going to be too specific yet, there's actually a pretty objective, or as close to objective as you can probably get in this sort of conversation, answer to who is more in the right, but it takes some giving and a pinch of that media literacy to get there. What I want you to keep in mind, especially if you aren't someone who's actually played through this game, is that there has been an ongoing debate about these characters going on for literally 6 years, and it hasn't gone anywhere because obviously it's a debate on the internet. I know I'm not going to solve that debate, in particular because I'm going to identify exactly why said debate has happened, but just bear in mind, pretty much everything I say is something people would argue about, even though most of this is just in the game. What we'll do now is introduce perspectives. And we'll do Dimitri first because he's ultimately a little simpler to understand. Dimitri, when he was a child, was subject to his entire family being killed in what became known as the Tragedy of Duscur, which has, in his late teenage years and early adulthood, cultivated a capacity for violence in him. However, he is pretty much what you'd expect of a fantasy game's protagonist otherwise. He's heroic, strong, clever, polite, all that, which is what makes the first time he actually snaps quite a notable thing. There are signs that that's going to happen before it does, but you kind of wouldn't expect it of his archetype, so it might take you by surprise. Either way, the core tenet of Dimitri's reaction to the war starting rests in the fact that the Tragedy of Duscur resulted in retaliatory attacks against the people of Duscur, a minority group in Dimitri's kingdom that amounted to a near-complete genocide. However, Dimitri figured that the Duscurians had been made scapegoats and weren't responsible for his family's death. He sees those who slither in the dark, these sort of shadowy, generically evil guys, as I said, probably the game's weakest area, and figures out that they probably had something to do with the massacre. When he finds out Edelgard had been directly working with them to undermine the church, he loses it a little bit. When you find him 5 years later, after the game's time skip in Act 2, he's become such an edgelord that you can't interact with him normally, and his writing definitely does take a bit of a hit here. He's all blood and guts for quite a while, and it's implied he's been waging a brutal guerrilla war in the interim that we haven't been seeing him in. While this may all be a result of the trauma he suffered as a child, I don't find that this justifies this per se, and keep that line of logic in mind. It'll be important later. Anyway, he's more or less like this until a classmate of his father, Rodrigue, who himself was a father figure to Dimitri, dies to protect him. From this point, Dimitri sort of has a bucket of ice water moment and comes back to himself. And his goal is to end the war with Edelgard, and even towards the end of his route, he tries to make peace with her and see her side of things in what I consider to be potentially the most important cutscene in the game, because it's the only time they get to talk as adults about their motivations. But peace just doesn't happen that way for reasons that are pretty clever, and I'm going to save for the very end of our timeline discussion, even after I explain Edelgard. Once he wins, it's a very triumphant, happily ever after ending that I think was pretty well warranted. And the flavor text at the end says he rules fairly and introduces commoners into having roles in the government. Also, Rhea, the one in charge of the church that Edelgard was trying to destroy, who we'll be talking about shortly, is no longer in charge at the end of Dimitri's route. So Edelgard gets what she wanted anyway in that sense, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now let's swap to talking about Edelgard for a minute. She and Dimitri knew each other as children, and they spent a year together, which is worth knowing, because they have a history. But more importantly, shortly after that year, Edelgard, alongside her almost a dozen other siblings, were experimented on until she was more or less forced to develop a second one of those magical crests I was talking about, alongside the one she already had. This has drastically negatively impacted her lifespan, as we see by her hair being turned white. We also know she has that experience in common with fellow student Lysithea, who can be added to Edelgard's class in a unique way for this reason. As a personality, Edelgard is definitely a little cooler-headed than Dimitri, and she remains pretty reserved throughout the game. As she says nearly all the way at the end, she is pretty detached from other people, in part because she's carried the burden of knowing what she's going to do for her entire life. She's very complex in that way because in order to figure out how you feel about the things she does, you have to make a lot of value judgments. Once again, we touch on the level of how thoroughly one wants to engage with the game, because some people just do not think about it that much. And once again, it's okay. Sure, you could consider her the unapologetic good guy if you play her route first, and the unapologetic bad guy if you play Dimitri's first, and a good majority of the discourse around the game is basically from people whose perspectives is one of those. But ultimately, the decisions that she makes don't have obvious solutions, and she too is working off of flawed assumptions, just as much as Dimitri is, and perhaps even more so in important ways. But before we talk about her anymore, we have to touch on our last major character, Rhea, the leader of the Church of Seiros. To grossly oversimplify and give away a lot of stuff you don't even get in Dimitri and Edelgard's roots, Rhea is Seiros, for whom the church is named, and more or less is doing things that are somewhat comparable to what those who slither in the dark did to Edelgard, except she did it to the player character in an attempt to reincarnate her own mother, the goddess of the game's religion, who instead just lives in the player character as a disembodied voice in your head. I know, everything I said, while true, is specifically difficult to find as well. This is what it's like explaining a 100-plus hour game in 20 minutes, but alas. Edelgard, nor anybody else, save for maybe those who slither in the dark, know any of what I just said about Rhea, especially in the roots that are actually relevant to Dimitri and Edelgard's conflict. Dimitri has few strong opinions at all on Rhea, really, seeing her as sort of a fixture in the culture he lives in. She doesn't play a major role in his character arc, though we know the religion continues under the player character at the end of his route. That's about it. Edelgard, on the other hand, does seek to actively destroy this faith, as she sees Rhea as the one ultimately propagating the crest system, which is ultimately true, in ways she both does and doesn't know about. However, this is still kind of a complex situation. She makes it pretty clear she fully intends to destroy this religion the people of Fodlan have lived with for a millennium, which ultimately is also a religion we know to be at least partially true, if not exactly in the way it was told. This is not something that should go unnoted, but I almost never hear about it in these discussions. Just because one knows they themselves could live with that religion and be fulfilled doesn't mean that it wouldn't leave a massive gap in the lives of those who literally watch their entire belief system shatter around them. Not to mention the fact that if history is anything to judge by, trying to continually repress this religion would probably spawn endless conflict, but I digress. Even Dimitri himself acknowledges this exact problem in that all-important cutscene I was talking about, and Edelgard more or less says that they're living without purpose, which isn't really her call to make. And this is where the cracks in this whole conversation start to form, because ultimately my opinion on the game can be summarized like this. Everything Edelgard does could have been done peacefully even if it would have taken longer, and nearly all of her goals are achieved by Dimitri in the end anyway, and those that aren't would have been bad if they did happen. However, and it's a very big however, I don't blame anyone who, even if they end up agreeing with that statement I just made after this video is over, still prefers Edelgard to Dimitri. Because both of them are quite well written, and Edelgard doesn't have that dubiously handled edgy phase. Edelgard also is not an evil character, but I would argue she is misguided. But there's a very specific reason I make a point of not blaming anyone for their opinion that I'll get to at the very end of the video, when I'll also explain why so much of the video about media literacy is about this game once again. But I'll finish out this point. One of Edelgard's other goals is to erase the crest system. Her method of doing this isn't really established, which is kind of fine, but there's sort of a problem inherent in the logic. That getting crests is something that just naturally occurs at birth, and while her way and Lysithia's way of getting a second one wasn't natural, most of the other people, if not all of the other people in the game with crests, got it the normal way. And the fact that this does just kind of give them an advantage in life and in fighting and such means that her goal to get rid of crests, what does that look like? If there's still people with crests alive when she's gone, then the problem still exists in some way. But if there aren't, that means she just killed all of them, which also doesn't seem like a great solution. So, I don't know. Other characters, even those with just one crest, do suffer from the crest system built around them, but Edelgard's way of looking at the situation just probably isn't it. Dimitri's route, meanwhile, has things end with him still, as mentioned earlier, making many of the same reforms Edelgard sought. I mean, Rhea, who's definitely morally dubious at best, and we know through other means to have been holding the continent back from all sorts of manners of progress, and otherwise was eternally in control, is taken out of the picture. Dimitri democratizes the government, and all of this without being the violent aggressor in a war, and without wiping out the primary religion of his people. I mean, yeah, sure, things can go bad after he's gone too, but that's just history. And considering he doesn't stake his claim on accomplishing something he realistically can't, that doesn't strike me as quite as big of a gotcha. The biggest matter of these all, however, is that Edelgard chose her alliances terribly. Every single soldier under Claude and Dimitri that dies is solely her responsibility. She argues that the casualties of war are less than the casualties of the system, but I really don't feel like we see that enough for it to ring true. And that's because, as you might remember, her main motivation for doing everything she does was her experimentation to force a second crest upon her. But who did that? Lord Arundel, a skin puppet for one of those who slither in the dark. Not a member of the church, not a member of the kingdom, in fact, an archenemy of the church and the kingdom. And yet, she works with this guy all the way till the end of the game after Dimitri and most of his class, and potentially Claude and most of his class, are already dead. Cities have burned and armies are slaughtered. It's a bit late to finally kill the comically evil mole people. If the church had been complicit in her experimentation, if it had been someone other than Lord Arundel, then maybe she'd have a point, but instead she decides that rather than attempting to solve the problem literally any other way, she must first work with the people who caused the problem she's angry about, to kill people tangentially related to the problem, and then finally, with the world burning around her, take out the actual villains. Even Dimitri, who never even learns about those who slither in the dark, incidentally kills their leader 3/4 of the way through his route, and does a better job of dealing with them than Edelgard. Even though Dimitri is completely wrong about who's responsible for killing his family for most of the game, he still deals with them better than Edelgard. But all this in mind, I still don't think Edelgard is evil in this route, at least not quite. Which I'm continually emphasizing because while I am ultimately Team Dimitri, Edelgard is still more nuanced than most of my fellows in that matter would give her credit for. And it's best emphasized by the very ending of Dimitri's route, which as an ending cutscene was so good that it alone probably cemented this game as my favorite of all time, which is why I'm only going to show you one more frame of it. But essentially, Dimitri offers Edelgard mercy at the end of everything, something which she, by the way, does not do, and she stabs at him, forcing him to kill her in self-defense. This might seem like the generic last lashing out of the villain, but I think it's something far more clever. She realizes she's lost and that the world can't go on with them both alive. After their conversation, she entrusts Dimitri with the future of Fodlan, all of this without words, and so gives him the license to finally put things to an end. It's really beautiful. Even if this video has just been me spoiling the whole game for you, if you have any interest at all at this point, just go play it. It'll still be good even with you already knowing this stuff. So all this said, I think the greatest success of media literacy one can possibly have with this game is that none of this minutia actually matters all that much. And the point of it is that Edelgard, Dimitri, and Claude are each charismatic enough to the right people that to those for whom they appeal, it wouldn't matter that they did the wrong thing relative to the other, because people don't make decisions that way. Most people don't choose their loyalties and their friends via any sort of logical deduction. I chose Dimitri first because I liked him the most. When I played Edelgard's Roots, I S-supported her. That's to say I got her specific ending because she was so well written. These weren't choices of logic, but emotion, intuition. So how does this all tie back around to media literacy? Have something where you can do this. Have a piece of media where you can make a 20-something long minute video where you break down exactly why you know exactly what's up about it. Have something like that. That's media literacy. So is Edelgard worse than Dimitri? I mean, sure. Looking at everything in whole, and considering that Dimitri still solves the worst excesses of the church and deals with the majority of the problems Edelgard does. But as the defender of the war, he really is in all likelihood the better choice for Fodlan between the two of them. But I'll never begrudge someone who likes Edelgard more, because that's just proof the game did what it set out to do. To set its own audience against itself and have sizable numbers of people who preferred any of the given three lords, and that's the most correct interpretation of the game as I see it. It successfully had all of us have this conversation to begin with. But anyway, that'll about cover it for our discussion on media literacy and my excuse to lore dump about Fire Emblem Three Houses. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have any thoughts of your own about this topic or the game, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every like and subscription goes a long way. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank our patrons, Shadowrunner, Sani, and Isaac Parrott, our Knights of the Inner Circle, Nico, our Knight, and Greer, our loyal squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, if you ever write something that has your audience arguing this much, you probably did something right.